You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Ahmad Atif Ahmad. He's a professor, part of the Department of Religious Studies at University of California, Santa Barbara. And we're going to talk about medieval Islamic law and modern Egyptian law. So, Ahmad, thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background. How did you get to be studying what you're studying and where you're at today?
Well, it started maybe 35 years ago or so. I was a junior high school student, started to read in the summer outside of the assigned reading. At that time, I wouldn't say that I was interested in Islam in particular, Islamic law. It's just where I came from. I came from Egypt. I grew up in Egypt, and I was interested in general questions, you could say, of how what we call knowledge affects what we do. So when I pretend to myself to know something, how this affects my behavior. And when we collectively as a society, at that time, of course, it was the Egyptian society, when the Egyptian society claims to itself to know something, to be sure about something, how this affects their behavior. Now, I didn't know the word epistemology at the time. It wouldn't mean anything to me. I was, of course, reading exclusively in Arabic. This is my mother tongue. And eventually I got a little more sophisticated, you could say, and started to understand that there are so many fields that I'm crisscrossing here, and then started to ask more narrow questions about social behavior in general, and still general, right? So I had to narrow it down even further when I went to college. I did two things. I studied Arabic and Islamic studies. That was one program, a bachelor's degree in that. Then I started to do my master's in Islamic studies. But while doing that, I also studied modern Egyptian law, which is another undergraduate degree. So with these three courses of study, you could say I was formed. But I continued to go back to these initial questions. So and recently I always had conversations with people who were talking about medicine, medical knowledge. And I asked, basic questions that I could have asked 30 years ago. Why are we sure that the masks are important outside? I mean, I could understand inside buildings, but how do doctors got us? How did they get us to wear the masks outside? It doesn't make any sense to me. Are they sure about that? So I'm basically interested in knowledge and how people behave based on what they consider knowledge.
Well, that's a great case study for you this past 18 months because, people are saying, oh, that's not science. And, people are using all kinds of labels to push their position. And I haven't studied epistemology or knowledge, but if you don't allow for debate, I don't think you're really going to get very far. And that's what seems like has happened. There's no allowance for debate. And yet people are being told, X, Y, and Z, and that keeps changing. So, I don't know what you'd call it, but instead of, epistemology, it's just propagandology. I don't know what you'd call it. Manipulation, manipulology, I don't know.
So people mention science all the time. If you're a scientist, you don't use that word. You don't say science because it's too general. Usually you talk about a very specific field, and you would vent as many frustrations as you would vent instances of pride. So scientists know that their work is tenuous, that they keep discovering mistakes, that they reconsider some of their positions, and that sometimes under the pressure of having to publish quick, they end up publishing things that they have to retract. That's science. That's the reality of science. So when I hear a 19-year-old or even a 50-year-old saying, oh, follow the science, well, the science, there's no book called science. Well, what kind of science are you talking about? This virus was this variation with now multiple variations. We have the alpha and the beta and the delta. So it's not one thing. And of course, people like me who are not specialists don't have the right to give a direct opinion, but I have the right to ask. until I see where the uncertainty is. This is where the epistemologist would be able to begin to function, because there's no such a thing as getting all the tools for different kinds of knowledge. I can't have the tools for legal knowledge and medical knowledge just quickly like that. It takes a lifetime, each one of them. But if you're trained to ask that question, you would pinpoint where the uncertainty is. Good physicians and public health specialists know that many of the assertions that were made recently are tenuous, and they kept changing them. And there's no fault in that. I think it's wrong when people say, well, I know this area, like I did 2 years in medical school, so you shut up. No, of course not. I mean, usually if you're not that good, you would talk like that. But if you're good and you've been doing it 20 or 25 years, you know that there are areas of uncertainty. Of course, in this country, it's become something of an opinion fest, right? Everybody has an opinion about it. And the opinion comes down to interest. Right? People who don't want to send their kids to school would come up with some kind of scheme that relies on some information they heard about the medical side of this issue. And people who are annoyed by the fact that their kids are home and are not enjoying their time and are not learning also come up with some kind of, they manufacture an opinion as if that's possible. And of course, that has nothing to do with science, not in my sense of the word.
Well, do you want to keep continuing to talk about this, or would you rather go to the other areas of your study? Or has this become, again, so fascinating that that's what this podcast should be about? What's your choice?
Well, we could do a little bit of both, but the disclaimer here is that I am a layperson in medical science. My parents-in-law, father-in-law, mother-in-law happen to be doctors, and I've had a lot of friends who are doctors, but that doesn't qualify me to speak about medicine, and I haven't done it systematically. I've, of course, become more fascinated with the history of science in particular, even though I started with the history of law. But I will have this disclaimer, right? If we talk about medicine or natural science, life and physical and mathematical sciences, as we call them at UCSB, I am a layperson. So I'll be providing a lot of caveats. But I'd like to take you also to my world of the legal sciences and legal history, legal philosophy, and say a couple of things about the things that I'm a little more qualified to talk about, the way we think about government, different forms of government, what Islamic law to this.
Let's talk about that. Yeah, let me know. What are you studying about Islamic law and current Egyptian law? What are some of the interesting things there? Let's refocus there.
Sure. So, the journey, as I said, is long. Islamic law is just vast. So I'm not done with it. I don't think I'll be done with it soon. Modern Egyptian law was more of both of a fascination and also a natural subject for where I lived until 97. I moved to the US in 97. So let's start with Egyptian law. Modern Egyptian law is a different creature from American law. American law is a confident, independent system that comes with actually sometimes assertions that are sort of over. So, for example, if you read Federalist 39, that's by Madison, he talks about the genius of the American people. So any constitution that's not Republican is not going to be reconcilable with the genius of the American people. That kind of language, and it's not just Madison, it's in Hamilton, it's in John Jay, and it's in all the documents. It's the nature of the Constitution. And the legal system has grown a lot in the last now quarter of a millennium, almost. We're closing on 250 years. So it's a tradition that struggled, that's American law, struggled with its common law origins, struggled with natural law, and rejected essentially both and started to build something new. Take Egyptian law as almost the opposite of that. It's a system that accepted that it had to borrow. Now, of course, American law says, the founders say that they're borrowing from Roman models and so on. But the modern Egyptians say explicitly that they will take French law, because it's one of the most advanced or the most advanced system in the 19th century, worked first from translations, which were pretty weak, but eventually built their own sort of jurisprudence until the middle of the 20th century. Then they sort of became independent. By 1949, there's this important moment where a man named Senhouri, who was the father of Egyptian law, says that, civil law in particular, he says that we have enough case law. We have enough judicial jurisprudence going back to the 1870s and 1880s. And from now on, our custom, our tradition as a population will be the most important element in interpreting the legal texts or the legislation. So this is the story of Egyptian law. It's interesting because it tells you a lot about similar systems that grew and developed in the third world. But my relationship with it weakened over time, partly because I don't live there. And then, the American law is just another world. And it's also vast. It's inexhaustible, not because of the time span. It's young, right? Comparatively to Islamic law or Roman law, it's very young. But it is also a big piece of land. And there are certain events that happen in the last 200 plus years. The fact that we had Native Americans, the Chicanos, now you see the change in the population. Just the recent census shows us that there will be a different America in 50 years or 80 years, and that will mean a lot of change. And we've just changed. I mean, the notion of the family. Think about this. When I took family law with Elizabeth Bartholet back at Harvard Law School, it was 99, 2000. The only state that had same-sex marriage was Vermont. Okay, and Massachusetts was about to follow suit. By 2015, when the Obergefell case was decided, which said that same-sex marriage is a constitutional right, going back to the 14th Amendment, there were 34 states, okay, and only 16 that were still holding on to the old definition. So in 20 years, American law changed a lot, and of course also is changing the world around. So I was justified to put Egyptian law on the side, even though the lesson of it was very useful. Islamic law is just an amazing thing. If you think about people writing in Arabic in Spain 1,000 years ago, and in Iran also 1,000 years ago, asking very similar questions about the nature of sales, rental agreement, partnerships in the market, and also family and crime and punishment. It's an unusual thing in human history that this thing even happened. And then it started to, you'd say, crumble, in the face of colonialism in the 19th century, and more importantly, nationalism. Modern nationalism in the Middle East and the Muslim world created an intelligentsia, a legal intelligentsia and a political intelligentsia that is not interested anymore in the old institutions. Also, the old institutions kind of give you that sense that, you live in a different era. For example, there are tons of laws about slavery, which, by the way, are surprising and would be surprising to many modern ears. So, for example, a slave in Islamic law in the 8th century, there is a bunch of texts about how the slave could be your essentially market proxy. And that slave would be, it's called al-abd al-ma'dhun. That slave would run your business, and sometimes would run so much business that he needs delegates. So you have a delegate, like a proxy for the proxy for the slave, right? And then later in the subsequent centuries, the slaves found dynasties, it's called the Mamluks in Syria and Egypt and India. So it's not the same Atlantic slavery that people are interested in, but of course it's slavery. Okay, so nobody's going to promote these institutions, even if we want to learn something from them. So anyway, Islamic law comes with that sort of smell of the past.
Well, you mentioned that Egyptian law is very unusual. Can you tell me some of the unusual facets of it for listeners?
So as I said, it was borrowing. So in the last few months, I had this study group with actually one of my professors who's now almost 80, and some of his students who could have been my students, but we had these Zoom meetings. It was wonderful, actually, this Zoom. We were reading texts by law professors who wrote in the 1920s, criminal law, and they were looking at crime and punishment. So one thing, for example, that faced them, because again, they come from this Islamic background, but they're embarrassed about it or they want to get out of it. There's something called zina. What is zina? Extramarital sex. So that's not supposed to happen. In a medieval Muslim society, this is a big deal, whether you're married or not. If you're married, you can lose your life. Okay? If you're unmarried, you get some punishment and you go back, but it is a humiliating punishment. So there is no encouragement for this kind of free love or anything. Then French law comes, and the French law they were reading is from 1804, and then from 1810, that Code Napoleon, which became standard in the Middle East, and at least the Francophile Middle East. And of course, there's a crime similar to this extramarital sex, but it is not because of religion. Okay, it's not because you're not supposed to be naked with somebody who's not your spouse. It's not because the pregnancies are going to be illegitimate. No. What is bad about this crime, the equivalent of zina, is one of four things: either rape or prostitution, or doing it with somebody who's married, or doing it with somebody who's underage. Okay, so these are the four crimes that constitute an extramarital sexual relationship that's now criminalizable in modern Egyptian law. There was a code that was written in 1904. Yeah, this is a famous penal code, 1904. So these commentaries we're reading is from the 1920s. And it's just wonderful, of course, to see that we can dial the clock back 100 years and look at that. But as I said, I am not doing much with Egyptian law. This is just one thing that we did in the last 3 months. And I just kept reading, and it's amazing how the modern Egyptian law professor is of two minds, is of two consciences. You know what I mean? That he has one conscience that says, yeah, my society is conservative. It's not going to consider, like, you know, if my daughter's 18 and she falls in love with somebody who's 20 because they go to college and they have sex, nobody's going to say that that's okay. It's unacceptable. It's an unacceptable thing. But the law is going to criminalize only these four instances of sexual relations. So if she's 18, she's not young, she's not married, and it's not rape if it is consensual, and there's no prostitution, she's not making any money out of it. So the professor is really conflicted. So if you say unusual, this is the first thing that comes to mind, is how the transition was so painful, both for the law professor and also for the lawyers. I've read a few cases with students over the years. It's a schizophrenic system. Schizophrenic is a strong word, but there are systems in the world that are like that are double-minded. And so this is one thing that you can learn from studying modern Egyptian law. It's now becoming increasingly less French, and it's borrowing more from American institutions, I guess, because of the globalization. And it's becoming more commercial too in its orientation. I mean, we joke now, the few Egyptians I still talk to, they say that if you want to do law and jurisprudence in Egypt, you got to be an officer or an engineer. These are the ones who actually make the law, because they build new cities and they have new city plannings that create relationships and positions. You know, this is where the homes are going to be, this is where the hospitals are going to be, schools, and then new relationships and just new societies that require new forms of regulation. And the military is pretty strong. If you haven't heard, you know, since that uprising, 2011, I think they came back with an iron fist saying that, no, we're not going to let young people go out in the street and say, oh, we want this and we want that. They're planning everything now. So it's becoming more of a organized society. I don't know. I mean, of course, it's not good for freedom, but it's good for some people, I'm sure. So yeah, that's about Egypt. I mean, we could keep talking about Egypt, but it's one country. I mean, it's my birth country. There's a lot of beauty in it, of course, but I'm not there.
Well, so you mentioned in the beginning epistemology. I know a few things like heuristics, you know, kind of a generalized way that someone accomplishes a task, and I guess there's hermeneutics, you know, it's how you, I guess, interpret a text. But so what's the intersection of epistemology and these legal systems that you're studying? Like, what's the fascination for you? It sounds like there is some intersection there.
Sure. No, that's great. Actually, you put your hand on very important elements in epistemology. One is language. When you say hermeneutics, this question of interpretation, gosh, it's vast. That also could be your lifetime a business, and you could bequeath it to your kids and it would keep going. Why? Because human language, of course, there are different languages, and each language, including this one, English language, is not one of the oldest, but it borrowed heavily from Greek and Latin elements. And then it evolved very quickly in the last 200, 300 years and became so thick. It's contributed to science, it's contributed to laws. It's different, right? Because of the British Empire first, and then the American experience. So how do you interpret texts that were written with very different intentions? This is part of legal epistemology. We know in this country, for example, one of the famous, more popular justices, he's gone now, he died 5-6 years ago, Justice Scalia. He called himself an originalist. What is that? It doesn't mean that because the Constitution was proposed, September 17th, 1787, and then it took a couple of years until they had the Bill of Rights and all that, that we're going to live in the 1780s. But it means that there are certain assumptions that the writers had when they wrote what they wrote. For example, the Eighth Amendment doesn't want you to apply punishment that is cruel. But if the people who wrote that didn't think of the capital punishment as cruel, then you are not allowed in 2021 to say that they must have meant that capital punishment is excluded by the constitutional language, by the Eighth Amendment. You see, so this is what he means. That solves many problems for him. He's not popular. I mean, that view isn't popular, although now I think on the Supreme Court we have enough people who would say that they are Scalia readers of the Constitution, but it's not popular in the academy. It's not popular among intelligent people, I have to say. I mean, Scalia was an unusually intelligent man, and some of his followers are very intelligent. But this is a very untenable position, partly because we live with this uncertainty all the time. The language changes. So if you're trying to keep a tradition, if you're trying to preserve a tradition, it happened a lot, by the way, in medieval Islamic law, this attempt at going back to the roots. At some point, there will be a breakdown. It just doesn't happen like that because language changes. And you might actually be forcing change in the Constitution. People just look back and say, oh, okay, this Constitution was written for 13 colonies. And they didn't even know if Rhode Island was going to come through. So they weren't sure. But the argument was, let's get together because we're very weak. They've divided. But now you have 50 states and you have a whole continent, very different populations, Native Americans included, Chicanos, Hispanics. So you can't really be that strict about interpretation. So back to the question of knowledge, because epistemology is a theory of knowledge. It's about knowledge. How do we know what is the right interpretation of that text? It's not that easy. I can't answer it. I don't even think the governor of California can answer it. There are many scholars who are struggling with it. Sometimes you would want to keep the tradition because it gets to be scary to keep changing everything all the time. But sometimes you have to allow that change. So epistemology provides you with tools to think about this and do it more systematically.
What would be like a systematic approach to a given issue then? What does that look like, applying the tools of epistemology?
So, yeah, when the subject that is the human subject that is governed by a certain law changes, the law has to change. Otherwise, you're trying to square a circle that doesn't work. So, for example, I think the census says the California population is majority Hispanic. Now, it was always a thin minority, thin white minority. So it was going in that direction for a while. Now, that must mean something about how we think about laws. If we had assumed, for example, that we can't have bilingual schools, or if we assume that we can't make the law accessible to people who speak Spanish, that's going to change. I mean, so this is one simple tool. If the language that's provided for regulation is made for human beings and the body of the human beings changed, then you have to change the rules. One thing, for example, a lot of Muslims struggled with after 9/11, people say nasty things about Islam all the time, okay? So, but Muslims are a minority, so they can't expect the average person to immediately just go and study and finally realize, oh, actually, Islam is just similar to other religions, and if there are problems with it, they exist in other. So, you know what I mean? So part of how I accept that common knowledge is not going to always be correct, and I have to deal with it. Now, you don't like it, you can live in a Muslim majority country. So I don't think the question of epistemology, the tools of epistemology are just there to give you a system of interpretation, but to notice the limits on public knowledge, the limits even on technical knowledge, and the nature of judicial knowledge and the legal knowledge that affect us every day. We live with this uncertainty all the time. I drive 75, for example, when it says 65. I don't expect to be getting a ticket, but 79, I expect a ticket. Why? There is an unwritten rule that there is something like marginal violation of the rules. Now, where do we get that? It's not written anywhere. And actually, some officers might decide, no, I'll give you a ticket at 66 miles.
Yeah, I've seen both, and I know what you mean. People get to know, like, you could skirt a little bit, but not too much.
Yeah, how do you know that? So you knew that it's in your social muscle memories because you lived in this country. So the text by itself is almost dead letter if we don't have that social custom standards. By the way, this is a very basic thing in Islamic law. Medieval Islamic law, because it's lived too long, and towards the last few centuries, 17th, 18th century, people were talking about this all the time, saying essentially that, yes, Islam started in Arabia, but it started in the 7th century. And it spread, and the majority of people who are Muslim now are not Arabic speaking, which means their customs are going to be prioritized over some of the basic assertions that were made by jurists from the 8th and 9th centuries. Was that a defeat for the tradition? Well, some jurists were wailing about that. I mean, can't deny that some people are conservative and they're always past-oriented and they look back to a beautiful past and always think the future is ugly and all that. But the majority of them accepted the reality. What they didn't like was colonialism. What they really hated later was the failure of their countrymen to be completely independent of these quick foreign influences. But that also ended almost, as many people know, that what colonialism did is create these two intelligentsias that had to negotiate. Some were modernized and studied in European schools and so on, and didn't care about the tradition, and some stuck to the tradition, and eventually they came close. I mean, they were both defeated, I could say, because if you take the Egyptian case, it's, the military came in the middle and said, you know what, you both shut up, because we're going to keep some of the old habits, some of the traditions that are part of our identity and we think are basic, which are pretty thin. And we will regulate religion and we will regulate liberalism, regulate everything. So,
question here: propaganda, censorship, ad hominem attacks, all this stuff seems to have really reared its head a lot the past couple of years here. Maybe more, I don't know, maybe I'm just more aware of it. How does that square with epistemology? Is it like the evil twin of epistemology, all these deceptive ways to get people to think one thing that may not be true or change their perception, by force, let's say? How do the two interact?
There are people who study that, actually, and I can point you to some interviews on the New Books Network recently just about that. So my take, information is available. Anybody can have information very quickly. What is lacking is perspective and cool-headedness, you could say. And what is really sad is they're pushing now even young people who have the time and have the tools to study, and supposedly we're working on educating them, to not study, because everything is there and everything's available and you can say whatever you want. The university is responsible because we've had professors who became activists. And I've always told my colleagues, the moment you allow yourself to be an activist, that's it. That's the end of it. You have to be above that. You have to tell both sides sometimes you're wrong. Or when you agree with one side, usually it'd be a qualified agreement, because you can't really research something very well and come up with an opinion that's exactly the opinion of a senator or a politician. And it just doesn't work like that, not in my experience. The other side is, of course, the government. I think we've had officials who really just went careless and lazy and started to use their authority and say, okay, we'll do this based on ideological or political positions. So how does this relate to the supposedly clean and reflective and good study of knowledge? It is, you're right, it is a deviation and it is a challenge, because if knowing something right doesn't matter, then of course eventually people are going to stop studying what they are supposed to study, and it will just be factions. I'm actually worried about that. I'm worried very much that the authority the university had has diminished so much that you can convince only people who are geeks. I meet these students who are just not going to worry about politics and they like to study, but their numbers are diminishing because money matters more. Again, politicians do it, professors do it, lawyers, of course, are paid for, and they just support a position. They know the conclusion, but they don't know the process. They work on the process to support a conclusion. So I hope we realize the folly of this, because it's not going to be easy. I can send you, after we're done with the interview, some links. Maybe you could interview people who are actually working on the epistemology of falsehood, right, and lying, and because that has become kind of a little niche. The one problem I have with it is the way it's being studied is social science kind of methods, where you talk to people. And that's, it's good in certain ways that you know what people think, but you have to be an amazing psychologist to guess why people say what they say.
Another issue with it is, if let's say you're a professor or whatever and you study it, then people that haven't studied it may look at you as a moral authority on it. So if you label something, for instance, as misinformation or bad, may or may not be, it's just your interpretation, and but now you have authority because you've studied it. So now you may be contributing to it.
I understand that. I mean, if people won't know the difference, you're saying, and that's fine. And I can't teach people the difference because it takes time to know the difference. So you're right. It's almost a secret pleasure or a rare pleasure. But when people live long lives, well, I can't assert that for sure, but many of them realized that the shortest path is to just know what you're talking about. The shortest path to equanimity, to comfort, especially like in your field, you can't afford not to know what you're doing. So why is this not extended to other areas? Sometimes it's hard to study all these things, sure. But if you care about something, you're going to study it. If you care about your kids' future, for example, and they need scholarships for a college, you will study that. You will figure out how it is done. So only when you don't care, you don't study. You just talk. But I'm with you. Yeah. No, I have no authority outside of this, of the borders, and even inside, I don't really have much. I just, I avoid.
Another problem is, like you've alluded to this many times. I hear this all the time. I'm not an expert on X, therefore I'm not going to speculate or comment. And I think that's very much a double-edged sword, because society is telling people, if you're not an expert, you have no opinion, just shut up, which I disagree. I mean, there's many amateurs, like you said, and self-motivated people that study something. It doesn't mean that now they don't have an informed opinion. Like let's say the virus stuff. So I've interviewed, 100 plus scientists and researchers that are dealing with it. I've read 40 or 50 scientific papers. No, I'm not an epidemiologist or anything, but I feel like I've been exposed to a lot more material, let's say, than, people that haven't. I'm not going to say I'm an expert, but I still have an opinion, and I feel like it's a well-founded opinion based on what I've read. But if society tells me, oh, no, you're not an expert, don't say anything, then me and people like me may say nothing, which is no good. So how do we allow room for amateurs and, amateur, a lover of the thing? How do we allow room for this in the public debate and not squash it? Because I think not just, I don't think we should just have a culture of experts.
You're right. I mean, of course, everybody's an expert in something. When I go to the bike shop, I know I'm an idiot and I don't know anything, and I don't offer my opinion. I let the guy just do his work. But you're right. There is room for the layperson's opinion. That is why we have democratic institutions. There is room for that, though. So, public opinion is not unimportant. So, for example, in the mask thing, we had an intuition collectively as lay people that some of the impositions on people's private life and just normal activities going outside were coming out of a sense of, I can do that, so I'm going to do it to you. So the rules changed so many times. I'll tell you a story. We have here a coffee shop in Goleta. We live in Goleta, California. That's where the campus is, UCSB. And a coffee shop, Old Town Coffee. I like the guy. His name is Tim. He works very hard. And he followed all the rules in the beginning. And then, they started not to follow them. And nothing happened because some of these rules are not necessary. In a patio, for example, you don't put the mask. But nothing happens because it's a patio. It's too big unless you're talking into somebody's mouth, which, okay, we understand that. So he could discourage people from coming too close and talking in people's faces. But I mean, I'm sorry to mention this example, but this is one case where I felt, the layperson has a better intuition here because he wants to save his business. And none of the people in the county or in the state are going to give him hundreds of thousands of dollars to save him later on when his business is defunct.
Well, not only that, he has the anecdotal evidence of seeing you every week. You're not dead. All his customers are not dead. Exactly. So he's like, all right, well, my customers aren't all dead. I don't think it matters. Why do we have to do this?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not true with it.
Right. So this is where the labor, there's something missing. Of course, we don't know why the people who are supposed to be experts did what they did, but we know, I think that Tim was right to, at some point, just give up on the changing rules that didn't make any sense, especially, again, that, as you say, empirically, he really saw, which is the scientific approach. He saw that.
Here's my worry is, you hear various pundits on TV saying, oh, that's just anecdotal evidence. Well, to me, this goes right back to epistemology, like knowledge of a thing. A lot of times just you can't do a double-blind, placebo-controlled study on everything. You can't. So you have to have anecdotal knowledge. And let's say you do a scientific study and you get 50 people in the cohort, right? Well, that's fine. But then let's say it's for a drug and you release the drug and now millions of people take it. Well, you're going to ignore that evidence and just say, oh, it's anecdotal. It's millions of people's experiences.
Right. No, I mean, we knew, for example,
that is a monstrous problem that is.
We knew Florida's numbers were not worse than California's numbers. And that, of course, made us all think and question, okay, if at some point we're going to tell people no beaches, the beach is an open space. if we say no beaches, and we know that we're not doing better than Florida, well, I mean, this is not a conservative or liberal issue. It's just, no. You have to explain to me why the California population is particularly more vulnerable than the Florida population. And if yes, then why didn't we get more sick people? The question also that was never raised lately is the age and the health status of most of the people who left us because of this pandemic. So, okay, I'm 50, and when I'm 80, I'm not going to expect the same resistance to germs. If I am going to be the casualty of the next pandemic, it's fine. I have to be fine with it because my body isn't able to deal with it. Now, I've never actually gotten the COVID thing. Got the vaccine back in April, and I travel a lot, so I've gotten PCRs. I can't count them. And I have to say, one advantage of this pandemic is that you travel now, and, I feel like I have a private jet, one that's called the Emirates airline, one that's called the Lufthansa. So these commercial airlines travel now with very few customers. It's really the best time to travel. But, I don't travel just to travel. I go to conferences and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you. I found myself to be listening more to conservatives and sort of resistance crowds. On the level of administration, though, in the university, I think the way the University of California and Santa Barbara did it was excellent, because we hesitated. We really we had an amazing group, the COVID-19 response group. Of course, they're much more informed than I am, and different kinds of scientists and so on. They captured the nature of the issue. Now you look at the campus; it's beautiful, with the kids back and skateboards and bikes and so on. We did it right. We wanted to just make sure that we know everything that can be known. And then we still have a lot of rules, of course, to control also some of the surprises that could happen. So, yeah, I mean, science does not preclude freedom. Science is supposed to teach us something. So and as I said in the beginning, we shouldn't really use that word in that general sense. Life science, people who study viruses, and other people who also study public health and know pandemics and studied the history of pandemics, are able to probably tell us something that's a little more nuanced than what you hear when you listen to CNN or these. So it's the reality it's not that frustrating, you know what I mean? So I think we can get it right, but just listen in and study a little more and not be judgmental. I hate, all the people who would say that somebody like this guy who's running a coffee shop is somehow evil because he just cares about his business. Well, he doesn't want to die. And so we have to be reasonable.
Do you think that epistemology has been improved or damaged or just changed based on what's going on?
It keeps changing. There are certain things we lost. So if you want to look to the past and lament anything, we lost that social sense of customs and social standards. The reason is the weakness in these social standards was built into it, that the community had to be small enough for social standards to mean anything. So New York is not going to be a community. San Francisco is not going to be a community. It's a bunch of communities. Social standards would work if you have a small community. This notion, Rousseau had this idea about the republic had to have a certain size. It goes back to Plato. But his idea is, we lived in Geneva, which, by the way, was independent, was not part of Switzerland. There was no Switzerland at the time. Rousseau wrote in the 18th century. And in his sense, the republic would be successful if it is also a little agrarian and if it is of small size. Why? You don't have to know everybody in your community, but you would expect them to behave a certain way. So that is lost. Part of theory of knowledge, so social knowledge, that was functioning maybe until the 18th century. The human population, I think, hit 1 billion in 1810. So before that, there were these communities that, people would, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000, that works. But once you get to millions, it's very hard to keep these social standards. So that's part of what an epistemologist would use that is really, unfortunately, becoming really hard to use. There are Supreme Court decisions that use the language of community standards. They were talking about pornography and things like that. Until the 60s and 70s, yeah, there are community standards. After that, I don't think you can use that kind of thing. So that's a loss. But now we have things that we didn't have before. I mean, we can't be down on our time. I can talk to you and you're in a different place. When I had these Zoom sessions, I'd have somebody from India and somebody from Egypt and somebody from Jordan at the time. So, and we're talking as if we're in the same room. We can know each other more. There are forms of knowledge that now exist that we didn't have. I didn't think that Musk was going to come close to this endeavor of seeing Mars and landing on Mars. It seems like it's going to happen in our lifetime. So this is all knowledge that was not available. So we can't be down on our time and forget all these things. I mean, look, of course, at Google has its problems. Okay, I'll give you that. You can Google something and the first hits are not necessarily the deepest or the most thorough, but you can keep going and learn a lot of things. I get a lot of manuscripts, by the way, Arabic manuscripts from the Middle Ages, libraries that you would need to spend hundreds and thousands to go and travel to go to Turkey and these places. And now I get them. So all this is contributing, is making my head better. I feel like my brain has improved significantly because of all these things that happened in the 21st century. But sure, I miss social standards. I miss the ability of a judge, for example, to say, you couldn't have understood the law wrong because this is what we do here. You can't do that now. A judge can't do that because we really have no standards. Yeah, you can pretend, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Of course, ignorance of the law is not a defense, but in some cases, it affects the ruling. And it affects, of course, juries. Juries always are affected by how they think they would do if they were in the position of the defendant. So, yeah, I mean, you can't really have it all. It's not all progress. It's not all decline. And I never really believed that you can take Darwin's idea. He was talking about organisms. He said organisms under a certain stress and over a long period of time have to go through what he calls adaptation, and then selection happens and you could improve or you can evolve. You can't take that and apply it to societies. You can't say that a 21st century society is always more advanced than an 18th century society or a 10th century society for that matter. You just have to look for the ideas and test their quality.
Yeah, because then you get into, well, what does better mean? What facets of it are better and are those important? And, what's the standard? And yeah, there's a lot of, you're right. You can't just say like, again, we're modern people, we're more advanced and we're better than before, because we may not be. Maybe we're not nearly as happy. We're not as healthy, et cetera. So maybe societies from the, earlier centuries were a lot better off.
By the way, are you on that? Are you closer to a pessimist or you're just really neutral and thinking about it?
No, my opinion has changed, especially over the past few years. I no longer feel like we're actually headed towards better things. I think we're probably headed towards worse. I just see like people's health and happiness and all that has been diminished. And I don't think we're necessarily going in the right direction. I think we may be going in the wrong one, actually. So I don't know if it's just, I guess it's pessimism, you could say. But I thought the other day, how they have, there's only like 15 or 20 different unique plots in all of literature. Have you heard that before?
Right. Now, yeah, sure. Because you can reduce them if you go very general. Sure. Right. You can even
like the hero's journey, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, I realized, I think that there's only, and I have no clue what the number is, but I think there may be, I'm just making this up, like 15 or 20 different lives that people can live. And I think a lot of people are just living the same life that has been lived throughout the thousands of years, and they maybe not studying history very much. And so they're just living this life that has been lived countless times before. It was just like I don't even know if it's an insight or not, but that's just one thing I realized recently. I don't know if you have any comment.
No, I am on board. With this. This is excellent. I actually thought we would begin with that because if you have a premise, if you ask me for a premise for my work, it's exactly that I have no right to start with arrogance because of the moment in history that I lived in. And in fact, over time, I arrived exactly at that conclusion. That look, when you sit and and read Aristotle, he's certainly smarter than many of your contemporaries. And how did that happen? The guy wrote 2,300, 2,400 years ago. And then the element that you were talking about is how the human capacity is limited. So at the end, we either live single or married. Some people live polygamous lives. And then there are very few options. This idea of freedom gives you infinite options. There's nothing infinite, nothing even large and finite. It's all limited and finite because we all have to sleep 7 or 8 hours. When we have children, they make a lot of claims on our time. So sure, we're going to repeat many things. It's amazing, of course, that we can only know the past through these documents, and it's always an imperfect knowledge. But man, if you and I could sit and watch a century, for example, anyone at any land, I guess that will confirm this idea that there's just so much similarity between what we think is a unique time and all that. But all that, admitting, though, what I said earlier, that we lost things they had, and we have things they lost. So it's broadly the same. It's broadly the same. You would like Arthur Schopenhauer. He's one of these people who insists that there is no change in the world. Why? Because everything comes from that human will. He thinks that biological fact is the most important fact. And it kind of doesn't matter whether you speak German or English or Arabic or whatever. You just live the same life and you have the same desires, and they're not going to be fulfilled. And Schopenhauer used to think that you have one of two movements. He's really pessimistic. It's too much. He says that you either have a goal to achieve, in which case you're sad because you didn't achieve it, or you just achieved it, in which case you realized how stupid and trivial it was. He had no rule for any of these moments that we enjoy. But no, I'm kind of in the middle of that. I mean, I definitely emphasize the pessimist side when I see that people are just unqualifiedly optimistic. But the world is just too complicated, Yeah. But I agree with you. The last 2 years definitely shook our confidence in the best brains in the world. And it's hurting me. It's hurting me because these are my colleagues and my friends and smart people. I like smart people, but I know they have they're stuck in certain ways.
I guess last question, why do you think that people that are, very smart are stuck, you said?
Well, it's a human limitation. So the people who are clearly better than me, they know more languages and they've studied different fields. And sometimes I struggle to just understand their research. They also, when I let this moment go and walk with them out and get coffee and so on, I realize, for example, that they're socially awkward to an extent that I can't endure, or that they have weird relationships and with other people. So it's just that you can't do everything. So now, what is the impact of that? If you don't have a family and if you are deprived of certain social pleasures, maybe scientific knowledge is going to be a burden, because then you will think of it more in mathematical terms, in machine terms. So, one thing, of course, I struggle with is how many machines we build. Some of the best engineers build machines to replace human beings. And they don't ask the question of what happens if we can actually replace all of them. What happens if we build a machine that does what you're doing, build machines? They can't ask that question. So I feel that advantage of having thought about these things differently from the point of history, from the point of languages, literature, philosophies, law. It's just that we're limited, Richard. So whatever you do well, you put a lot of time into it, and other people did the same thing, but none of us is the collection of all these things. There's no human being there's no Übermensch, like Nietzsche was hoping to have a superhuman. There's no such a thing. So why are they like that? Because they're human, and no human has the right to pretend to be God, And this is, even if you don't believe in God, the concept of God is beyond the capacity of any individual human being. And I think knowledge should make you humble, not arrogant.
Well, very good. Well, Ahmad, what's the best way for people to learn more about your work? Where can they go?
You know what? You can come to any class. Why? Because I am able now to accept people, auditors, by Zoom. Of course, I like in-person teaching, and I'm going to go to my students and have 20 people or something like that in the room. But if you're passing by UCSB, we don't have any. I'll ask the students if they're bothered by the number of people who are attending. But my classes are going to be available to anybody. There are a few things that I have on YouTube, but they're just esoteric. I mean, I have very specific questions usually for lectures that are given to, or the books. I've written 5 books. They're just, they're not. There's one textbook that came out in 2017, but it is also for juniors and seniors, for upper division students. But look, if a random person reads the book and has a question, they can email me. I'll answer.
Well, very good. Ahmad, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. It's been a good call to speak to you.
Thank you, Richard. Good luck with your projects.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.